الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
استووا واعتدلوا يرحمكم الله. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. وسيق الذين كفروا إلى جهنم زمرا حتى إذا جاءوها فتحت أبوابها وقال لهم خزنتها ألم يأتكم رسل منكم يتلون عليكم آيات ربكم وينذرونكم لقاء يومكم هذا قالوا بلى ولكن حقت كلمة العذاب على الكافرين قيل ادخلوا أبواب جهنم خالدين فيها فبئس مثوى المتكبرين. وسيق الذين اتقوا ربهم إلى الجنة زمرا حتى إذا جاءوها وفتحت أبوابها وقال لهم خزنتها ألم يأتكم قيل ادخلوا وقال لهم خزنتها سلام عليكم طبتم فادخلوها خالدين وقالوا الحمد لله الذي صدقنا وعده وأورثنا الأرض نتبوأ من الجنة حيث نشاء فنعم أجر العاملين. وترى الملائكة حافين من حول العرش يسبحون بحمد ربهم وقضي بينهم بالحق وقيل الحمد لله رب العالمين. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. قد أفلح من زكاها وقد خاب من دساها كذبت ثمود بطغواها إذ انبعث أشقاها فقال لهم رسول الله ناقة الله وسقياها فكذبوه فعقروها فدمدم عليهم ربهم بذنبهم فسواها ولا يخاف عقباها. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. بارك. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Today, Brother Usman Qureshi has come very far to discuss the economics of brotherhood. He's part of the London Muslim Support Network, and he has very valuable information, details, and things to talk about with us. All brothers are requested to stay behind and gain from Brother Usman Qureshi, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Salatul Isha from tomorrow will be 9:30, inshallah. So the screen's showing for tomorrow. So Salatul Isha from tomorrow will be at 9:30. Jazakumullah khair.
Is that the one? Yeah.
We can try.
The only thing is I've got this adapter here.
Okay, Bismillah.
Yeah, does that work?
Oh, actually, will work. Only thing is short.
It's too short. Yeah.
Well, let's try. Bismillah.
Maybe we can put it back a little bit.
If you make yourself comfortable, just make it.
Yeah, please, if you don't mind.
If you just want to go to this side.
Oh, sorry. Of course. It's actually over here.
Okay, Bismillah.
Yeah. Should we put it back?
Jazakallah khair.
Which one is it? Okay, the 570. Is that it? Yeah? Do you want to put it in? Yeah. Is that the one? Is that the one?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brothers, while we're waiting, inshallah, we'll just take a few moments here. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah. I'm reluctant to see brothers at the back. If you go back, I know some of the uncles are, mashallah. But anyone else, please do come forward, because his sunnah is to come closer to the speaker, inshallah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by the way, says, يَرْفَعِ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا مِنْكُمْ وَالَّذِينَ أُوتُوا الْعِلْمَ دَرَجَاتُ اللَّهُ بِمَا تَعْمَلُونَ خَبِيرٌ. Allah will raise those amongst you who believe and those who have been given knowledge in ranks. One of the purposes of these gatherings, obviously we are here to meet each other, praise Allah, but it is also to gain some knowledge, and this knowledge in Islam is sacred. Any ilmi knowledge that comes to us, deeni knowledge, it is sacred. It elevates us, inshallah. So that should be one of our intentions. We come to these gatherings to get the elevation in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We are very, very fortunate to have our guest speaker here. As brother, the Sheikh already mentioned, his name is Usman Qureshi, and he's currently the trustee of Norbury Muslim Center. And he is involved in the London Muslim Support Network. He's also been a headmaster, previously a headmaster in Al Khair Islamic School in South London, and was a trustee for Hugs, helping household under great stress. And he's also a brother of Usman Qureshi from Cage, if you know. He's also quite famous, mashallah. So we're very fortunate to have a brother who've come all the way from South London. So do appreciate this, acknowledge this, and inshallah we'll get some time at the end to benefit from his knowledge, inshallah. Jazakallah Shaykh, over to you. Assalamu alaikum.
Yeah, it's not good. Yeah, just, I don't know if it's...
Just going to show there.
Yeah? Okay. I don't know if it's... Okay. I don't know, it's not working. Yeah. Let me try again. Take this out. You're probably looking at the number of tabs I've got open. It's a bad habit. Sorry, brothers. Just give me 1 second. No, that's better. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. Jazakallah khair to the masjid for allowing me to speak, to share some of my thoughts on what I hope won't be too technical. Okay, Jazakallah khair for what is often unnecessary introductions. Okay, I'm going to sort of disappoint you early on and tell you that I'm not an Islamic scholar. I'm not an economist. I'm really just a teacher who's taken an interest in an area that I hope I can communicate somehow, articulate that it's important for Muslims to be thinking about, and it's possible that a number of you have already, so I hope that it won't all be new. Please do, if you can, if you survive by the end of this lecture, do offer feedback. These are really thoughts about a community that really is quite young in the UK. When did the Second World War end? Who's a history buff over here? Go ahead, young man. MashaAllah, 1945, right? Good. Right. 1945, the Second World War ended, and Britain essentially opened its doors to the Commonwealth. Why? Because it was short of men, it was short of people in its industries, and it needed people to come over, and they did. They came in large numbers. They came from the subcontinent, they came from the West Indies, a number of places in the Commonwealth, all coming here as economic migrants, as people who are coming to really settle, establish themselves, make their way. Especially, my parents are from Pakistan, I was born here. But it was around the same time that we had partition. It was very turbulent. Things were very early on in Pakistan. And so it was a good reason for people to come here as migrants. And they did, my parents did. I hope, as I said, I'm going to talk a little bit, give you an overview of what it's going to be about, and hopefully try to connect the dots as we go along. But just to, I suppose, get a better understanding of what the discussion is about, what I'd like to do, if it works, which it's not, see if, okay, is just to define some terms that I want to maybe use in the lecture, okay? Now, these are definitions that I found to be useful for me. It doesn't mean that you might not object, okay? So, the points are actually, there's a point that I want to make. So, by the end of the talk, if you feel that you have some alternative views, you have some questions, you have some disagreements with what I'm saying, I'm very eager to listen to them, because this is all a formulation of my own thought, okay? So, I'll be very willing to listen. Just going through the three that I've got here, brotherhood, because it's somewhere in the title, the Economics of Brotherhood. And for me, it's that sense of feeling of obligation that one Muslim has to another. And I could go through various ahadith and ayat that really, I suppose, prove that point, but let it suffice as it is, because I've got a little bit to get through. And something that's not directly in the title, but I will allude to, I will talk about, is culture. The ideas, customs, and social behaviors of a particular people or society, okay, with the emphasis on ideas. And then finally, community, a group of people sharing certain common values and customs. So, what is the proposition? What am I here to really talk about? What am I concerned about? And I'm sure lots of others are, because I've spoken to them in the community. Putting that all together, I would say that we're experiencing a change in ideas, and more crucially, the way that we think. And that's important. I'll keep talking about this as the lecture goes on. The way that we think, or not, right, as the case may be. Because, you might be under the impression that my thoughts are my own. That the way that I think in the world, and the way that I act in the world, the way that I behave in the world, is purely to do the way that I, want to do, the way that I'm thinking. But you might feel, you may not, by the end of the lecture, that there are other influences, right? Or that are having an impact on the way that we think, right? So what I'm saying is, or proposing, that we're experiencing a change in ideas, behaviors in the Muslim community, which seem to be negatively impacting that feeling of obligation, that brotherhood we have to our fellow brothers and sisters. And I'm arguing and I'm proposing that actually I think we're moving towards becoming a little bit more selfish. What I'd like to say at this point also is that I come from southwest London, near Croydon. And what I'm aware of is that London is a completely different animal to the North England, for example. And the experiences of Muslims are not necessarily the same everywhere. Okay? So some of the things that I might say, you think, that doesn't really, I've never experienced that, which will also be useful to listen to, because even London can be quite diverse and different. Okay, so these are just my thoughts and perceptions as we go along. Right, what I wanted to do is to engage a more younger audience and be prepared for that. But we've got, two youngish people, and so now I'm thinking that the next 3 slides might be a little bit patronizing. But if you'll let me, I'll just go through them anyway, and I won't put, because they're only 2 young people, unless they want to put their hands up and say, it's not a trick question actually, it's pretty straightforward. Anyone? I'll let anyone do it, to be honest, it's no problem. Yep, go on. Oh, excellent, yeah. And we all know the verse in the Quran, I'm sure it's been said many times. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. Allah says that He has not created us except for His worship. Okay, so worship is that purpose. What can we hope from Allah if we do as He says? Go again, yeah? MashaAllah, good. The reward in paradise. The reward in paradise. To be honest, actually, I'm saying this and it seems fairly obvious, and everyone's going, that's very obvious. But part of my contention going through this lecture is, or this discussion is, how much does that really feature in our day-to-day lives? How connected are we, really? Honestly, you have to do muhasabah, you have to sort of account yourself and think about yourself, the day-to-day decisions that you make, how much of those are connected with this purpose, with this idea that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to hold us accountable and He's going to ask us about everything that we've done. Okay, and then that desperation or that desire to be in the Jannah and not to spend even a millisecond, a nanosecond, in the fire, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be just. And there's no free ticket for a Muslim that I'm a Muslim, therefore I will go to the Jannah. It doesn't work like that. There would be no justice if that were the case. We believe, we're made to understand from the ulama, that Muslims will go to the paradise eventually, but who would want to spend even an iota of time in the fire? Oh, I was supposed to ask something else before that, so I've jumped ahead now. And I've sort of given it away, but I'll ask it anyway. Who was the best of the Sahaba? Yep. MashaAllah. Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, who was the companion of the Prophet ﷺ in the cave, the father-in-law of the Prophet ﷺ, and his closest friend. What did Abu Bakr do that the scholars say earned him the most reward? There's something in particular that they say about Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu that earned him a lot of reward. Yes, you could call it charity, yes. It's very similar, but maybe a little bit more detailed than charity. Does anyone else know? Yeah? Worship, I think broadly a lot of things that Abu Bakr did could be classified as worship, but that's not untrue. Yeah, good. Anyone else? Yeah, good. Yes? Yeah, excellent. I mean, it's not exactly, but you're right. That's why he's called a Siddiq, because he affirmed the night journey. Absolutely. Anyone else? Yeah. Yeah, there's a particular sacrifice. I'll tell you what I'm driving at. Maybe yes, go ahead. The cave. That's not precisely. It's something to do with an action that he did that really, the scholars say, earned him immeasurable reward. And what he did, I'll sort of cut to the chase a little bit, is that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, he spent an incredible amount of money, of his wealth, freeing slaves. Okay? How did that earn him a lot of reward, freeing the slaves? In fact, his father would often say to him, why are you freeing these slaves? They're not able to defend you. They are people of no consequence. They don't have a big qabila, they don't have a big tribe, they don't have, an army, they've got no money, they've got no position, they're nothing. Why are you freeing them? What he didn't realize is that among all of these people that Abu Bakr radiallahu anh was going to free, they would be people who essentially, the whole of the Muslim Ummah today would in theory have taken or owe their Islam to. So imagine that those people that Abu Bakr freed, either most of them or the majority of them, would have gone out, and from their da'wah and from their calling people, the whole of this ummah will have accepted Islam and be doing deeds. So the scholars say that, until Yawm al-Qiyamah, after the Prophet ﷺ, Abu Bakr radiallahu anh will be earning pretty much the good deeds of the whole of this ummah, subhanallah. And he gave that money up, not feeling at that time that that was going to be the case, because what did he know? He was just freeing them for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What he wasn't thinking about at that time is, should I invest in that property over there? That seems like it could mature in about 10 years and be really good for me. He wasn't thinking, well, my riding beast looks a little bit old. Maybe if I buy another one or a camel or another 10 camels, that will be a good investment. He was just thinking about one investment, and that was the pleasure that he was going to earn from Allah. And subhanallah, the only the only person to be called by all of the gates of the Jannah Yawm al-Qiyamah. So in summary, and we haven't even got into the topic, this is just a beginning bit. Really very simple. Allah created us for His worship. Our focus should be to enter the Jannah, and the ultimate prize will be to do what? Is to gaze upon the face of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But in order to do this, we must have a mindset, and this is key again, thinking, mindset, the way that our minds work, right? Has to be connected to the idea of pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and seeking reward. Okay? Seeking reward. Right, anyone have any difficulty with this at the moment? It's pretty 101 stuff, yeah? Okay, we'll move on. Okay. Now, in 2018, in my local area, I conducted a questionnaire. We had 35 odd kids, and I gave them a lengthy questionnaire. There was about 50 questions on it. They weren't happy. But, there were lots of incentives for completing it. Really what I wanted to do was to find out what was going on in Muslim households. It's all very well speculating or trying to imagine what's going on, but I asked very intrusive questions, okay? Not with their names or anything, so I wouldn't know who it was really at the end. And they wouldn't have filled it out if I had asked them to put their names. So it was completely anonymous, but what I wanted to find out what are parents doing in terms of their connection with the Quran, the amount they come for the salawat in the masajid, for example, lots and lots of things. One of the questions at the end that I asked was this one in the middle. What do you think would make your parents really proud of you? Okay, this is quite interesting. There's a reason that I asked it, but out of the 25 people who filled out the questionnaire properly and that I could use that material, 23 of them, or I'll start on the other end, 2 of them wrote down answers that I found surprising. One of the answers was, my parents would be proud of me, really proud of me, if I memorized the Quran. The other one said the same thing, and he said that I will be a person who will be involved or standing up for his community, or some words like that I can't particularly remember now. Okay? But the other 23, which is really what I expected, I suppose, talked about some sort of academic achievement or worldly gain or worldly achievement. Okay? That's what would make their parents really proud. And I think that it's interesting that 2 of the kids didn't say what the other 23 did, right? Because what it strikes me at that time, and it still does, is that there is a very particular type of messaging that we're giving to our children all the time. Really, we're getting that messaging as well, all the time. But this message is being passed on to our children routinely. And we don't often really think about it. I mean, if our children are coming back to us and saying, or they're telling us that the most important thing is really material success, isn't it? I remember when I was the head of Al-Khair, someone that you know over here, he was your imam, I think, for a while, Sheikh Shukur. He also worked with me, at the school. And it was interesting. It was the first day coming back, and I was addressing the oldest kids at the school. And I told them that, if you work really hard, you're going to have your 10-bedroom house and your Maserati and all of this sort of stuff. And Sheikh Shukur came up to me and he said, bro, did you find no other incentive other than that? And at the time I thought about it and I said to him, no, I didn't find any other incentive. What will make children come in day to day to a place they don't particularly love and, study lots and lots of subjects that they particularly don't want to study? Only some incentive that they already, they talk about BMWs or Audis or whatever else they talk about, right? So that seemed to me to be the most sensible incentive, and to some degree it still does. I mean, I've been a teacher for a while. I've taught not just in Islamic schools, I've taught in the state as well. And really, how do you get kids to go through that system day after day, mostly unhappy? What incentive can you give them? But the trouble is that that's a problem. To tell your children that the most important thing is material success is part of the challenge that we're now facing, as we're I'm second generation, I was born here, my parents are first generation migrants. So we're now into third, fourth, maybe even fifth, I'm not sure, third and fourth generations. We're starting to see some problems that we didn't see before. I grew up with my parents in their culture broadly. I speak Urdu, I understand it, I go back to Pakistan. I'm aware of the traditions, I'm aware of how to behave in a sort of a Pakistani household, I suppose, right? But as as the generations have gone on, my generation don't speak to lots of my friends don't speak to their children in Urdu. I married abroad for that purpose, but they don't. Most of them have tried to speak to them in Arabic or English or something like that. And that's important. I'm going to come back to it, really. But anyway, I just want you to hold some of these ideas that we've spoken about at the moment as we go. And I'm going to try to explain, ultimately, how and why some of these things that I'm talking to you about, some of the way in which we're thinking, encouraging our children to think, and society is thinking, is deeply problematic. And what I want to do is to look at a particular hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that really, I think, talks about this quite interestingly. And it's a famous hadith, I'm sure most of you know it. I will read it off the screen. It was reported by Thawban that the Prophet ﷺ said, "A time will come when nations will call one another to stand against you in the way that one is called to dine. It was said, will we be few on that day? The Prophet ﷺ said, no, rather you will be many, but you will be like the foam that rests on the sea. Allah will remove fear from your enemies' hearts and cast a weakness into yours. It was said, O Messenger of Allah, what is this weakness? The Prophet ﷺ said, the pursuit of material pleasure and an irreverence of death. Now, I've changed I've translated in a way that I prefer, okay, because the standard translation at the end, which most people remember, is Hubbud dunya, love of this life, karahiyatul maut, hatred of death, which I don't think always, works very well. It doesn't really explain the hadith for me. But the hadith is interesting for many reasons. Fundamentally, because this is a prophecy of the Prophet ﷺ. This is where he's telling us about times that will occur, happen for the Muslim community, when enemies, our enemies, whoever they are, will come and stand against us, call each other against us. And I think, without going into too much detail, because it's not the theme of the talk, right? We as a Muslim community in the UK or anywhere in the world could probably feel that more widely or generally, okay? That there is certainly it happened after 9/11, there was a coalition effectively against the Muslim community in the world. So there are very, very clearly signs of what the Prophet ﷺ is saying here in this tradition, okay? So the next thing in this verse which is interesting is, will we be few on that day? At the moment, we make up about 25% of the global population. That is a startling amount of people. About 2 billion people in this world. And if you think about it, brothers, 2 billion people in this world, a sizable sum, seem always to somehow be at the bottom of the world ladder. Scrambling around, being, attacked from one country to another, and sanctions being put on, and God knows what else. I mean, you could spend a whole day talking just about that. But it seems as though that number is of very little consequence, because the Prophet ﷺ says something really interesting. I want us just to focus, I suppose, more on this point, and it's the imagery that the Prophet ﷺ uses here. He says, you will be many, but you will be like the foam or scum, it's also translated, that sort of sits on top of the sea. And when you look at it, it's vast. You can see a lot of it, can't you? But it's interesting that all you need is a slight ripple or a small wave to go into that scum or that foam, and suddenly it's dispersed. It just breaks apart. And it's really interesting that the Prophet ﷺ uses this particular analogy, that there's a lot of you, but actually if there's a challenge, if there's a problem, then that unity that you can see, or that number that you can see, is actually of no strength and of no value. That's what the Prophet ﷺ is saying. And the companions who are with the Prophet ﷺ and evidently feel the strength of Iman, being with the Nabi, being under his guidance and feeling the strength of the gains that they've made in Islam, they're completely confused. How is this the case? That the Muslims will be so vast in number and yet we will be so powerless? And the Prophet ﷺ says that the reason is, and he says, wahan. Love of this life, or I call it the pursuit of material pleasure and in irreverence of death. So there's a tying here. The Prophet ﷺ is making a tie between the idea of seeking the dunya and weakness in the Muslim community. And I want you to hold on to that as well as we go on. I want to mention just 2 or 3 more narrations and verses, and another verse that I think is quite important and connected to this, especially as the last hadith talks about an irreverence of death, or being sort of unconcerned with death, as though I'm going to live forever, that I just need to struggle in this world and amass as much as I can because death won't come. Like, it's not in your mind. Right? The Prophet ﷺ encouraged us to visit the graves in order to be connected with the idea of death and be always connected with our mortality, that we will die. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Imran, كل نفس ذائقة الموت وإنما توفون أجوركم يوم القيامة فمن زحزح عن النار وأدخل الجنة فقد فاز وما الحياة الدنيا إلا متاع الغرور. Every soul shall taste death, and you shall be surely paid in full your wages on the day of resurrection. Whosoever is removed from the fire and admitted to paradise shall win the triumph. The present life is but the joy of a delusion. Yeah? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us here, and He tells us, this verse is repeated, the last verse anyway, or the last bit of this is repeated fairly frequently in the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is always telling us, listen, You are in this dunya, but frankly, it's just all mata'ul ghurur. It's just deception. It's a delusion. It's a mirage. It's a fantasy. It's not going to last. Don't stake your claim on it. It will not serve you for the long term. Okay? And the Prophet ﷺ said in an authentic narration reported by Amr ibn Auf, the Prophet ﷺ said, by Allah, I do not fear poverty for you, but I fear that you will be granted the riches of this world as it was to those before you, and it will destroy you as it destroyed them. So all the way through these narrations and hadith, we've got a connection between what? Worldly pursuits of pleasure, wealth is spoken about here, and this idea of breaking between the Muslim community of some sort of destruction. That's not particularly clear from this hadith, but it's all around the same theme. And the last verse that I want to mention is this one in Surah Al-Isra, verse 16. وَإِذَا أَرَدْنَا أَن نُهْلِكَ قَرْيَةً أَمَرْنَا مُتْرَ فِيهَا فَفَسَقُوا فِيهَا فَحَقَّ عَلَيْهَا الْقَوْلُ فَدَمَّرْنَاهَا تَدْمِيرًا. When we decide to destroy a town, we command those corrupted by wealth to reform, to change. But they persist in their disobedience. Our sentence is passed and we destroy them utterly. What is this corruption, brothers and sisters? What is the corruption here that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about? I mean, in the translation that I put up, right, it says that they are corrupted by wealth. But maybe the translation needs a little bit more explanation. Is wealth or money in and of itself evil? No. How much goodness, how much khair do we know that two companions in particular, Abdurrahman ibn Auf and Uthman ibn Affan, how much khair did they bring to the ummah just through their wealth? There is no evil in money or wealth in and of itself, obviously. I'm sure that's very clear. So what is the corruption here, brothers and sisters? What is this corruption? Yes, go ahead. The way that people use it. The way that they use it, the way that they think about it, the importance it has in their life. Okay? And tying it back to the verses and hadith that we're looking at, it's the idea that it itself is the end. When Uthman ibn Affan, Abdurrahman ibn Auf were amassing seismic amounts of money, seismic wealth, their intention, and Allah knows best, was what? That this is just a means. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us an opportunity to do what? To do khair. And as much as they gave, they received even more from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It was never the objective, it was never the goal. That money is the thing that we're going to strive for, as it has become today. Right? People talk to me, as they do. I'm just another person in the community. Bro, I need to make some serious investments. Why? What's going on? I need to leave my kids' property. I said, yeah, why? Why? By the way, a conversation is not just one or two. This is now something that I hear more commonly. Yeah, it's the right thing to do. Right? As in, it's wrong. I mean, I've got no intention of leaving property behind to my children unless I have it. So am I doing something wrong? Is this something that the Prophet ﷺ ordered us to do that I somehow just slipped my notice? There's a hadith somewhere which says, make sure you leave property behind for your children. It certainly says, the Prophet ﷺ said, don't leave them begging, but that's slightly different to a £500,000 house, surely. I don't think the Prophet ﷺ said that. So there's been a change, as you said rightly, for the reasons of what money is. Is money an end? Is it the ghaya? Is it the goal that we're looking for? No. It's simply a means to achieve khair. And the one who has it, the one who is blessed with it, is obliged by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to show gratefulness for that blessing by spending it as those two companions did. But you see, I just want to mention a couple of things, one of which may be a little bit controversial, I don't know. That I'm worried, and this is where I start to, I suppose, make my point a little bit more. I'm worried about, and I've been involved in investments. I'm a businessman as well. You know, I have been. I'm recently stopped being a businessman, but I was for the last 8 years. And so I'm aware. I speak to the Muslim community, people who have money, they want to make investments, those sorts of things. So I have a broad idea of what goes on. And I'm not entirely happy is not the right word. I'm scared almost in some ways. If that doesn't sound too, I don't know, too emotional a way of saying it. I am a little bit. I was sitting down with a brother who has at least 3 or 4 properties. I know he does. And he's got about over $1 million liquid asset, sitting around. And he's done well for himself, mashallah. He's done very well for himself. And he speaks to me, about investments and, And he said to me once, he said, bro, you know what? There's a guy, he didn't tell me who it was, thankfully. He said, there's a guy, brother who I know apparently, he asked me for 50K to start a business. He wanted a loan for 50K. And I said, what's in it for me? And he said, well, I just need to borrow the money, bro, if you can lend it. And he goes, why should I give him 50K and get nothing from it? I thought, you got more money than you know what to do with often. And this brother has come to you asking for £50,000, which is really a drop in the ocean for you, compared to the amount of wealth that Allah has given you. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about giving loans, qard hasana, and that there's so much blessing in it, and you're saying, what's in it for me? I mean, I really, frankly, don't have much to say to him after that. Do what you want. But for me, it's like, what's wrong with just helping? What's wrong with just giving that brother some money and earn ajr from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? This is going back to what we discussed at the beginning. We said this is 101. I mean, ultimately we're going to die. How do you know? He's in his late 40s, maybe early 50s now, right? What are you going to take away with you? You don't even need that money, and you can't lend it to a person who needs it. Another incident happened more recently. There's a brother who rents a house, rents a property, rents it for about £1,500. His earning is not that great. His landlord I know personally, and that his landlord has a property, he has 2 properties, he's got a business that he does well from. And look, in the last sort of 6 months, we know that things have become tighter, right? Things have become very tight. We all know that the prices of things are going up, and we're struggling. And at this moment in time, right? And he knows that brother's circumstances as much as I do. I know he does, right? He decides to hike up the rent. I mean, like, I know he's not sleeping. It's not a case of that he's asleep and he doesn't know, and he's not aware of the fact the prices are going up, because I had a conversation with him about 4 days ago where he was complaining to me about the hike in prices of his business materials. But at this time, there could have been another time. I'm not saying it's up to you to raise your rent as you wish. You own the house and you can do so. But this is the wrong time. And he knows that, But just so there's no dip in the amount of money that he's getting in, he hasn't really thought forward about the impact that this is having. And I'll tell you, it's an imam. It's having on an imam who's living there. I mean, what's he going to do? These sorts of things, increasingly bother me, brothers. And I'm wondering, why is this happening? We stand at the pulpits, or imams do anyway. Imams stand at the pulpit, scholars stand at the pulpit, and they're talking about ajr, and they're talking about khair, and they're talking about the hereafter, and they're talking about all of these sorts of things, but somehow there's a change, okay? I mean, I was talking to someone who was complaining about a brother who goes on Hajj every year, and he was saying that there are people in everywhere, not just in our community, everywhere in London, who are suffering. Otherwise, forget about the current crisis, they're suffering. And the brother will go every single year to Hajj. And I remember there was a story of Abdullah bin Mubarak. I don't know if you know the story. He came after the Tabi'een. He was on his way to Hajj. He's a very learned scholar. He was a mujahid. He was a businessman, and he would go yearly to Hajj. And he would go and make quite a significant travel, so he'd carry lots and lots of provisions with him. And when he was going to Hajj one year, he came across a woman, a Muslimah, who was eating dead animal from the floor. And that's not permitted in our faith, right? And he said to her, he said, "Sister, you shouldn't be doing this." And she said, what do you want me to do? I don't have any other means. How do I live? Abdullah Mubarak decided to take his provisions, right, and go to her house and he knocked on her door, and he basically took all of those provisions and he said, "Sister, this is all for you. Never eat from the haram again." This person is on the way to make Hajj. A significant journey at that time. We're not talking about fast planes and cars, trains and automobiles. We're talking about a long journey and lots of provisions. Right? And this person is an alim. He's a scholar of Islam. And I've had this conversation with brothers, and I said, there's a point there. I mean, you're going to Hajj every year, and there are people in your community who are desperate. And somehow, even worship has become so personal, like, well, look, and it should be to some degree, right? But to leave your neighbor or to leave people in your community struggling while you go off and fulfill for the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th time the Hajj. There's something to think about. Abdullah Mubarak completely exemplified that. The story goes on that when he went back to his home, the people started congratulating him on his Hajj. And then he sort of said, I felt ill, I couldn't go. And people swore to him by Allah that they saw him there. And then Allah inspired him in a dream where an angel was deputized, so the narration goes, on his behalf, and his Hajj was accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, what I'm driving at here, brothers, in these examples is there is a shift, I think, in the way that we think, in the way that we behave, in the way that we act. And I think that's really, really important. And what really influences, or what's influencing our thought, and I'll try and speed it up here because I've been talking for a long time. What influences our thought is really the culture that we're part of, right? That's important. And I'll try and move a little bit more quickly so that we can get to the main part, or the end, I suppose, really. What is culture? Culture is it exists in the society you're in. It's part of every institution that you interact with, whether it's schools, hospitals, businesses, everything. Okay? There is a particular logic, a way of thinking behind those institutions. Take the RSE, the relationship, sexual relationship curriculum. Okay? Schools are an institution. Our children are going to those schools. They're going to hear, what is the logic? The logic is equality. The logic is we're all equal, and so if there are people who want to practice homosexuality, then they should be allowed. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. So that becomes part of a logic, a way of thinking about the world that becomes planted, in your mind, in your mindset. And that, after a few generations, will just be an absolute norm. I wouldn't even call it a norm at the moment. There are lots of people who, not just religious people, who have a problem with it, but it will eventually just become, the word is, institutionalized in people's minds. Right? And this is really, really important because we don't pay enough attention to the idea of institutions. Right? So, what determines the logic of our institutions? What determines the logic? What is shaping the way that institutions in our society, what type of thinking that they have? Oh, go ahead. Yeah. freedom. Yes, definitely. I think freedom is a part of it. It's not one thing, so freedom is definitely a part. Yeah, good, mashallah. Freedom is definitely a part. I mean, there's a longer discussion. I don't want to have that here. We don't have the time. I need to sort of move on, right? But I think what we really have to do is to think very, very carefully about how things like freedom and equality and all of these, the first sound of it sounds reasonable. There's nothing wrong with that. And in some ways, it's not, right? But institutions and the logic that they have, right, affect the way that we think. Now, if we think about it, most of the time we spend, and our children, they spend in institutions with a logic that we don't necessarily share, brothers. Okay, that's the reality. And now, what's happened with mobile phones? I lived in a time without mobile phones in schools, right? And there would be a cut-off, wouldn't there? You'd come back from school, you'd get on the bus, you'd come back, and then you'd walk home, and you might have your friends walking home with you, and then you'd get home, and that's it. No more friends. No more nothing apart from mum and dad. Different culture, different ideas, different way of existing. And no one would even think about calling anyone's house past 9 o'clock. That was a big no-no, because you'd find an irate Indian woman on the end of it, shouting, "Why the hell are you calling at this time?" Some of you are nodding, and you'll remember, right? Some of the younger ones won't, right? But now what happens is, that culture that we have, that we were able to leave behind, actually now enters into the house through the mobile phone, because our children are connected to it all the time. And I'm sorry if I'm not making a good case for mobile phones here. I don't think I should, right? But that culture doesn't stop now. It's 24/7. And that's really, really important. So what ultimately, and it's part of what you said, Jazakallah khair, what's determining the logic of these institutions, and this is the point, and hopefully we'll get to it now, is a philosophy of self-interest, a way of thinking which is about self-interest, or I would say selfishness. And the champion of this idea, well, I've gone too far, is this chap over here. Does anyone know who that is? I'll be pretty surprised. I didn't know who he was until I started reading about him. He looks very wise, very intelligent. He is. His name is Milton Friedman. Does anyone know who that is? You know? Yeah. Oh, you're spoiling my presentation. That's exactly right. Exactly. Oh, fantastic. Do you want to give it? Absolutely, yes. He was effectively in 1947. There was a group of radical intellectuals who called themselves neoliberals, as you said quite correctly, and they were proposing a different way of running society or the economy. Okay. Now this chap here, Milton Friedman. Oh, I spoke that as well. Some of you might know who that is. Milton Friedman, and I've just sort of taken a piece that I think really spells it out quite nicely. He was an evangelist. He really believed in this very strongly, in free market principles. He believed, more importantly, in the primacy or the importance of self-interest. This is how you drive the economy. Make people just completely absorbed, about their own benefit and themselves. This is an idea which to some degree has some merit. It has some, it's interesting. I'm not trying to rubbish all of it, but because of time and because I'm not a scholar in it, I'm just drawing out the main points. Whatever the problem, his solution was, out with government. Government should be very small, and business should run everything. Okay? So, the government should turn every sector into a marketplace. Healthcare, education, by force if necessary. And this is interesting. Even in a natural disaster, competing companies should be the ones to take charge of organizing relief. And, those of you who are as old as me or older will remember that really there was only one charity when we were younger, that was Islamic Relief, I think. And barely, I can't remember Muslim Aid, but I remember Islamic Relief. And there wasn't Muslim Hands and Al-Khair and this Khair and that Khair and whatever, right? There's only like one, right? And now we've just got lots and lots and lots and lots of charities. For what reason? I have no idea, right? But we do. All I can see is that we create lots and lots of jobs for people, and the money that should go to beneficiaries often doesn't, right? But you see, there is a whole logic in this. Even think about it, brothers. When the Prophet ﷺ used to stand up and he'd say, who is going to give money for the sake of this battle, for the sake of this expedition, or for the sake of whatever, the Prophet ﷺ was offering them what? What was he offering them? Jannah. To be with him like this and other things, the Prophet ﷺ would promise them. What are we promising? We're promising a night out in Saffron Kitchen. We're promising a 3-course dinner. We're promising celebrity imam. We're promising whatever. Isn't there something strange about that logic? It doesn't sound like the logic of the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ is calling you to an eternal reward with Allah and what's pleasing to Him. And you're saying, it's quid pro quo. You give me some money and I'll give you some food and then we're sorted. It's a completely different way of thinking. And this is what I'm saying. I don't think that Muslims have really caught on to the fact that our thinking is being subverted. And I hold that chap slightly responsible for this. And, as you quite rightly said, and you've said it now who it is, but those of you, again, as old as me or older, will know who this woman is, right? And I used to watch Spitting Image when I was younger and really enjoyed it. And if you don't, it's great. Not the new stuff, it's rubbish, the old stuff. This is Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister of this country from, was it 1979 to 1980? 1979 to 1989, I think, or something like that. She had many names, Milk Snatcher, Iron Lady, and so on and so forth. But one of the things that she did is that she took the ideas of this chap, Milton Friedman, neoliberal ideas, and she and Ronald Reagan really brought them into force in a big way. I'm just going to give you an example of how that happened, and I'm not going to talk on for too long. But just as I was going to do pop trivia, but we don't have time for it, I was going to say who were all the prime ministers, after Thatcher, but maybe another time. So where does the self-interest or the selfishness come in here? It comes in, so when we're talking about neoliberalism, we're really talking about capitalism, okay? And sometimes in the Muslim community, people go, oh, not that again, not capitalism. It's always about capitalism. But I would say there's a lot of ignorance about what happens in capitalism. And I think people sometimes misunderstand it. Because people say, there's nothing wrong with doing trade. And then I say, that's got nothing to do with capitalism. I mean, it's part of it, but that's not what capitalism is. It's not trading. Trading happens in socialism as well, right? It's something very, very particular. But without going into the detail of it, what the idea really, at its core is saying is that there are resources that are scarce, okay? Resources are scarce, and the idea is that those resources are available, okay, through the idea of a market, okay? So when something is scarce, there's not a lot of it, and the way to get it is through a market or by having money, then what is it that people are going to want? They're going to want money. It's that sort of basic idea, sort of essentialized it, tried to make it quick and easy. But it's driving not just a need, it's a craving for money. Why? So that you can get as many resources for yourself as you can. Okay? Now, really, how did this happen? I want to give an example because I'm a teacher and I've got more experience in this field than anywhere else, right? This is an example of how Thatcher did it, or the Conservative Party. And really, that economics, the Thatcherite economics, has really been around for the last 40 years because, broadly, neoliberalism hasn't changed, even through Labour, because you'll say, well, we had Labour, we had Tony Blair, and we had Gordon Brown and whatever. But when Thatcher was asked, I don't know if anyone knows the answer to this, Thatcher was asked, what is your greatest achievement? Does anyone know what she said? Does anyone know what Margaret Thatcher said when she was asked what's her greatest achievement? She said it's Tony Blair, right? So she was able to co-opt Labour into following the same sort of broad economics, of what she was doing. Anyway, I'll make the point very quickly. 1988, her Education Secretary, Kenneth Baker, brought in the national curriculum, which people are not really critical of, they should be. Why did they do that? They did that because a few years later they were going to introduce mandatory assessments amongst school children, SATs, SATs, and GCSEs, but those were already there, O-levels. So if you are able to give everyone the same curriculum, that means that you're able to test everyone in the same way, and that means that every school, and this happened in the time of John Major, can be placed on a league table. So you have a league table of all the good schools and all the bad schools. What do we think this did? What did the league tables do? Good, excellent. It basically gave parents choice. What it did is it created a market, right? You can now choose where to send your children. And what is the scarce resource here? What is the scarce resource that parents are worried about? What do they want at the end of all of this? They want high-flying jobs, high-flying careers in the city where their children can earn hundreds and thousands of pounds. They can earn well, parents are set up for life, all of that sort of thing, right? So there's a need. You create a market, you know that those sorts of jobs are scarce, right? And so you create this drive, this almost sort of mad individual drive of parents struggling, fighting for grammar school places, for private school places, for bursaries to get their children into these schools. I know I went through the system, right? So when you're creating a marketplace in this way, what you're really doing is creating a deep amount of self-interest. This is not about let's all learn together. Let's all support each other. It's no. What did your child get? Your child? Oh, he only got B. Oh, right. You know, my child got an A. You know, my son got into grammar school. You know, he's doing really well. And people ask these questions to each other all the time. I'm sure you have all experience with it. It's like, you know, the mark and standard of a person is a person who is getting into grammar school or this or that and the other. Really? This is what we've been reduced to. But what it reflects keenly is this idea of, you know, this almost individualism, okay, of, yeah, I need to get ahead, I need my children to get ahead, and I really don't care who I leave behind. So this is the creation of a market, and I've got another 5 minutes and then inshallah I should be done. One of the things that it also did, I'm not sure about here, I'm not sure, but I know in the southwest of London, is that when certain schools do well, what do parents do, especially grammar schools? What do? Wealthy parents, wealthy people, they're able to buy property. And lots of people even rented property. Because one of the rules of government of grammar schools is that if you are in a catchment area of that school, you're more likely to get in. So lots of wealthy people would either buy property in those areas or rent property just to get their children into those schools. Okay? And so what happens is that you get a ghettoization in community. You find places where the poorer schools are, those areas tend to become more run down, the property prices are cheaper because no one wants to send their children to those schools. And then now you find, certainly in the southwest, like, I don't know about this area much to be honest, but you can find literally pockets of communities sitting not even half a mile away from each other with massively, from a completely different social background, just because of schools, right? So what it did is it created in society this sort of separation of classes, separation of wealth, okay? And what I'm coming to the end of saying, I suppose, is that the Muslim community really has bought into the same ideas, you know, and sometimes I feel much more than anyone else. This sort of thirst in the way that this chap, Professor Charles Tripp, he's a professor at SOAS University, he's got a book which is very interesting called Islam and the Moral Economy. And he says, in a capitalist system, the market is not only the major site for the exchange of commodities, but becomes the supreme institution and dominant metaphor for most social transactions. Through material incentives, it has changed the way people think of themselves and the world, encouraging new forms of association and reinforcing a value system linked to material growth. So what he's really saying is that people are no longer valuing each other on the basis of them being people, but of what they have. So you'll find even Muslims do this. They'll mix with people in their broad social classes, but, I'm a doctor, he's an electrician, it doesn't come together. Things like that have started to happen, which in my opinion, isn't in conformity with the way that Muslims should behave. We don't, when the Prophet ﷺ talked about piety and he talked about God consciousness, he didn't talk about our wealth. He didn't talk about the way that we look, the nationality that we are, where our parents come from, which part of India they came from, did they come from Lucknow or Hyderabad or whatever. The Prophet ﷺ never talked about this. He came to stop all of this happening, and now a Muslim community is reinvesting itself in these ideas slowly. And this separation is happening, and this is just another quote. There's a famous thinker in the 20th century, Muhammad Abduh, which you may have heard of, and he said, was concerned, capitalist accumulation and the qualities promoted by capitalism diminish the power of such moral restraints as compassion, mercy, solidarity and cooperation. These are the sorts of things that we're talking about. So when we're talking about ghettoization and people who are wealthy in different communities, what happens is really the poorer members of our community are left completely on their own. You'll only go to functions and network with high-flying Muslim individuals. You've got the Association of Muslim Lawyers, you've got the Association of Muslim Doctors, you've got the Association of whatever, and all of these wealthy organizations and people meet with each other, but they're not really meeting with other Muslims in their community, in their societies. But a lot of that is down to what? The way that the economics of our society work. But we're falling in line with it, we're falling in step with it, and it's affecting, long term it will, even if it hasn't, even if you don't see it clearly at the moment. My opinion is it's going to radically alter the way that the Muslim community thinks about its faith long term, and it is already happening. So this is the last slide or two, right? These are just some points that I wrote down these are observations. Again, you can disagree with them if you want, but I've talked about some of them. Wealth is no longer a means, it has become an end in itself. Parents will sacrifice, so I see this happening a lot. Parents will sacrifice community activities in favor of tuition and other lessons. Bring him down to the circle, bring her down to the circle. Yeah, but he's got judo and she's got this and he's got clarinet and he's got, but I don't know what they're doing, right? Or they got kumon and they got whatever, right? So it's always now, there seems to be some precedent, or some importance given to those sorts of activities. And then really what happens is that, and it happens sadly, I smiled, but I'm not happy about it. But, eventually when they get to 18, 19 and the parents come and the mother is wearing a dupatta in the masjid, and she comes, she goes, brother, please help. My son is acting like a complete, he's got a girlfriend, he's got this and he's got that. And I think, well, we're Muslims and we'll help, but we're not magicians. Right? But where was the emphasis and the tarbiyah earlier on when your children were growing up? Why weren't they there? Because you made an investment, your thought, right, was to invest in their, I don't like to use the word, but I don't have a better word, secular education, right? You chose, not that that's a problem, but you chose to, put attention there. And by the way, I forgot to mention, what I'm not saying is that we shouldn't be worried about our children's education. I think we should. I think Muslims should never be mediocre. They should be at the top of their game everywhere. That's not, I don't mean that at all. If that came out, I don't mean that at all. The two boys, out of those 25 respondents who responded, they are on the top of their game at the moment. I can tell you, I know both, they're at the top of their game. MashaAllah, right? So there's no okay, well, either they're going to be really good, brother, at education, or they're going to be good at Islam. Who said? That's just your perception. You can definitely have both if you take the right step. Prioritize what you say at the beginning, this 101 that we talked about, what should we do, why do we worship Allah, and everyone's going to say the same thing. But that's what I started with. How much do we really, when we're making decisions about how to live in this country, how to bring up our children, how to be with our elders, how to interact with our elderly parents, what sort of decisions are we making, and how much of those decisions are influenced by our faith and the values that we have in our faith, and how much are they being influenced by the economics of the society that we live in. Just finishing off these points. Families meet less. This is something that actually I find a big problem. I don't know, maybe it happens more in this community, happens almost not in Southwest London. Families used to meet fairly regularly when I was younger. We used to meet our friends' parents, and you know, there was always a form of education. I remember going to a janazah, and I stood with an elder in the community, sort of late 80s or whatever, and his family member had passed away, and I stood there, and then I just gave my condolences. And then a friend of mine came up to me, he said, bro, you know how to do that really well, you know, how do you know how to do that? I thought, I don't know, I didn't read a book. You know, it just happened. You know, when we were younger, we'd go with our parents when they'd go and do it, and then you just learn it as you go along. Isn't that how it works? I mean, I didn't do any special course, but you pick these things up, you know, when you go and you interact with other people, because that's where your values are. Your values are not in a book. You can't give a book and say, here, read this. Read? Tick, 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 done. I was the head of an Islamic school. One of my most outstanding students in Islamic studies is now an atheist. Yeah. So it doesn't mean anything, brothers. You can give people as much information as you want, but if you're not engineering a community, a society, the values that you need to have, and your mindset is being diverted, right, then there's a potential for these problems to occur. So do meet up with other people. There is a ghettoization, I talked about that. Increasingly wealthier Muslims have less need for fellow Muslims. This is also interesting. When our parents' generation came, they needed each other, and so there was more. Now, because you're wealthier, you can buy people and you can buy expertise. And what need do you have for anyone? So as you get wealthier, there's a psychology of need that also changes, doesn't it? And it's related to the next point. Wealthier Muslims can purchase the service of good imams for their children. See, another way that our mindset is affected, because before we'd all say, no, we need to get an imam, and all of our children will study, because there was no other way. But now, religious people, practicing wealthy Muslims, I know lots of them, right? They say, oh, these madrasas, they're not very good value. You know, even though we don't pay much, you know, I want my children to learn more. And I say, don't you want those other children to learn more? Why do you just want it for your own son? You know, for your own daughter, لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يحب لأخيه ما يحب نفسه. None of you truly believe until he loves for his brother what he loves for himself. If you want more khair for your son and for your daughter, you want it for the rest of your children who are in the Muslim community. But now, because we have the pesetas, we go and then we hire, either in Egypt or in Syria or even locally, we hire people and we say, we get the best imam for our kids, but everyone else, well, they can make do with that guy over there. That's a mentality that's growing within our community, brothers. And this is, I suppose, the broadest point. Muslims see the world not through the prism of faith, but through consumption. We become consumers, right? It's all about, even when we come to the masjid, it's like people put, you know, activities on. We come and then we take the activity and then we run away. It's not about being part of community. It's sort of saying, well, I'm a consumer. I'm giving you sadaqah. You see that box over there? I put sadaqah in it, and that's why I come and I take part of the activities. But I'm sure most of the people help out volunteers. They don't get paid for it. What stops you getting involved? Why are you a consumer? Why are people consuming religion in this way? Be part. You should be part of a community. And yeah, I'll just sort of finish. This is the last slide. We should prioritize our spiritual welfare over a material one. We should see our wealth not as an end, but as a means for reward, as Abu Bakr radiallahu anh did. We should create a stronger sense of community to promote our Islamic values and culture, not act with an individualistic mindset, brothers, but consider our collective benefit. and develop institutions. I didn't really talk about it enough because I deviated a little bit, but develop institutions which carry the logic, the thinking of our Islamic values for society. And that's for all of society. That's not just for Muslims. Muslims should be thinking about how our values can help shape positively the rest of society as well. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to strengthen our understanding of His deen. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from those who give as well as take. And I ask Allah Jalla wa ala to keep our hearts united and to strengthen our brotherhood. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Jazakumullah khair for your patience, for your time, and for, still being here, mildly awake. Jazakallah khair. Jazakallah khair. Jazakallah khair. Yeah, go ahead. All right, ask. Yeah, that's fine. Yep. No problem. Jazakallah khair. Thank you.